Good. Thank you very much. It's Tanya Sheldon, the National Secretary of the Transport Workers Union. Today we're coming together to talk about the critical issue about 5,000 families that have been thrown on the scrap heap by Qantas. Many of those jobs outsourced overseas, and many more turned into part-time jobs in Australia, where families now have to be expected to work for $200 a week below the minimum wage by having minimal hours. This company has lost its vision, it's lost its capacity, and has decided that there's no future for the airline when the future is obvious. These families here aren't here to fight against Qantas, they're here to fight for Qantas. We're reaching out to the board and to the Prime Minister to say this company is worth fighting for. This company is worth having a future. This company is worth turning around and having Australians stand up and saying to the board, change your way, stop investing in Southeast Asia, we've squandered hundreds of millions of dollars, and start investing in the Australian public that made this airline so great. These families behind me, many have been here for 10, 20, 30 and some 40 years when the company's been profitable, when they've made this company profitable. Now Oxford Economics, the most respected think tanks, economic groups in Europe, have identified these workers who are on an average of $51,000 a year, who contribute over $205,000 in profit to the aviation industry. But what does Alan Joyce and the board and the federal government do with that? They squander it. They've squandered it by supporting an outdated strategy, and ever since it's been implemented has failed to deliver an outcome that's been successful for the company. We've seen profits lost. We've seen the airline having dozens of planes in failed expansions in Asia, sitting in airports, not moving a tyre. We're seeing millions of dollars squandered each week, and yet we're seeing Australian jobs sliced and diced. In discussion after discussion with the board, discussion after discussion with the federal government, none of them have a plan for the future, because they've invested in a board strategy that has failed for 4 years, and continues to fail with the strategy that they've embarked on in these last number of weeks. You can't make an airline great by destroying 5,000 families. You can't make an airline great when at one point they're worth $10 billion and this board has sunk it now down to less than $2 billion. It's a critical time in the history of this country to have our national security protected, and national interest protected, and Australian families protected. Not from the challenges that any industry has, but from the challenges that is a board-set disaster. Many of these employees here and their families, when there's been SARS, when there's been bird flu, when there's been wars, when the company has called upon them to take wage freezes, deferrals, to go to part-time work, to reduce hours, to turn around and make sure the company is successful through discussion that's always been achieved. But this company has failed to discuss, to negotiate and set a strategy for the future. They've only set a strategy for decline. And I can say this, and I say this directly to the coalition, we're not going to stand by and see jobs offshored overseas, jobs made in this country part-time without a fight. We're not going to stand by and see this airline be nothing more than Aeroflot with a kangaroo on its tail. This company deserves more, and this country deserves a lot more. Now, thank you for your time. We're going to have some speeches shortly from real people that are fighting within Qantas to make sure this great airline is great yet again. But with me today also is two great fighters in the Qantas fight, in the community fight, to make sure that we have a chance to make this airline great again. Tanya, the Deputy Opposition Leader. Tanya's been a great supporter of Qantas and Qantas workers, many of whom are in her electorate, so she's seen the struggles that many of those families have been and the pressure they've been under, particularly in these last couple of years, and again with this latest announcement. And of course, Bob Catter, a family who has a long history of supporting Qantas in its early days, and the great history of Bob Catter, who's always been there for Qantas families, whether it be in North Queensland, whether it be in Sydney, or whether it be across Australia. Two great fighters that have fought and can continue to fight for the Qantas struggle to make sure this airline remains great.
Thanks so much, Tony. Look, it's a great pleasure to be here today to support Qantas workers and their families. When Tony Abbott said before the election that he was going to create 1 million jobs, we thought some at least of those would be in Australia, not all overseas. What we see with the offshoring of Qantas jobs is a loss of a skilled workforce here in Australia, a skilled workforce that's not easy to replace. But what's worse, we see dislocation and uncertainty for Qantas families. I feel this quite personally. When I was growing up, my dad worked for Qantas for more than 20 years, and I know what it meant for us to have that pay packet coming in every week. The security of a roof over our heads, a meal on the table, all of the things that a regular income provides for a family. And to think that 5,000 families are facing the uncertainty of losing that pay packet coming in every week, I think is devastating for local communities. We know that a lot of Qantas workers live in my electorate, in Matt Thistlecoat's electorate, in Kingsford Smith and around the airport here. And the dislocation that it causes for the whole community to have those thousands of people losing their jobs is really hard on local communities, and I know that we'll hear more about that later. I think it's clear as well that Australians feel a really strong emotional attachment to Qantas and the brand of Qantas. Qantas is everything that Australia has wanted to be in past years. When you look at the tourism industry in Australia, every time a Qantas jet takes off overseas, every time a Qantas advertising campaign runs overseas, people see images of Australia that make them want to come here, that make them want to visit Australia. And Australians travelling overseas feel a great deal of pride in our national carrier. They want to see the flying kangaroo keep flying. They don't want to see it as roadkill. We know that Qantas came to the government saying, we're in trouble, we've got some problems, we need your help. And instead of sitting down with Qantas and discussing what the government could do to help in a reasonable, in a responsible way, the government said nothing for months. We had Treasurer Joe Hockey out there kind of hinting, implying that there might be something the government could do, and then bam, at the very last minute, Tony Abbott as Prime Minister says no, there'll be no help for Qantas. There'll be no help for Qantas. We're going to liberate the workforce, we're going to liberate capital, we're going to allow foreign airlines to buy as much of Qantas as they want. If the solution to Qantas's problems was larger amounts of foreign investment, that could already happen under the rules as they are. That's not the solution to Qantas's problem. And we urge Tony Abbott and the government to sit down with Qantas and say, what can we do to help the flying kangaroo keep flying? And we want Tony Abbott and the government to sit down with the Qantas workforce and say, what can we do to keep these jobs here in Australia, not offshored? Thanks.
Thank you.
I come here today representing three entirely separate groups. One is my homeland, Cloncurry, where Qantas was born, between Cloncurry and Winton. Two, the early pioneers that put a huge amount of their own personal money to get this airline going. And three, I come here shamelessly to say I am the last protectionist left in Australia. I represent. I come here today representing the Country Party, which was shamelessly and aggressively protecting Australian jobs, protecting Australian corporations, and protecting the economy of this country. We have presided over, and Tanya is one of the good guys, so I don't include Tanya in my criticism. We have presided over the sell-off of almost every institution in this country. So let us have a quick glance at the future. You will live in a country that will be owned by foreign landlords, a country in which a deregulated labour market will have you working for virtually nothing. And you can pick up the newspapers in Australia day after day, and they will be advocating $8 an hour. Well, that'll be rather intriguing to see how people will be able to stay alive, because the average accommodation, according to Demographia, the international report, says the average accommodation cost in Australia is $20,000. Well, when you take, $5,000 or $10,000 tax out in accommodation, well, it'll be interesting to see how a family with a few kids is going to buy enough food to stay alive. Now, you can fix this up in one single instant second by looking at the value of the Australian dollar. And that is something no government will look at, and in one fell swoop, if you're complaining about high wages, well, that halves, in a way, the cost structures in Australia immediately. All cost structures are cut in half, but still preserves the standard of living for our employees. Now, I just want to conclude on this note. My granddad put an awful lot of money, probably a little bit more than we can afford, into Qantas, and he intimated to me as a little kid that, he said, all right, we lost a lot of money. He said, we never put the money in there to make money. We put that money in there because our country needed aeroplanes and aeroplane services. That's why we put that money in. And so we, amongst thousands of other Australian families, it was only a little tiny country then, Australia, we put our money in so our country could have our own airline and our own airline services. Now, the current border Qantas, they are going on the international market because their share prices will go up. They will all get richer. So they want to sacrifice their country for their own personal enrichment. So they are the complete opposite of the people that founded this airline. And if there is a betrayal, it is the most appalling betrayal. And one other thing, Tony, I'd like to add. As the leader of a tiny little political party, Tanya leads a very big political party, and the last vestige of the country party in Australia, as a representative of that point of view, Tony, I have to say that without these sort of policies, then we are doomed, and we will live in a country where there will simply be no jobs. I mean, if you're closing down the petrol industry, as the NRMA told us last week before last, if you're closing down the motor vehicle industry, we shed 10,000 mining jobs in Queensland last year. Well, where exactly are you going to get the jobs for these people to go to in the Australian economy? And I say they will simply not be there. They will simply not be there.